So we're gonna have these three chapters today: Surah Al-Kāfirūn, Surah Al-Nasr, and Surah Al-Masad. Let's start with Surah Al-Kāfirūn. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Before starting this chapter, I want to explain that situation when this chapter sent down and to be more familiar with that situation. In this way, we can understand this chapter much easier. Well, a group of disbelievers went to the Prophet and they started a conversation with him, and they told him that this religion that you brought to for us, Islam, is not a new religion, and the God that you introduced to people, Allah, is not a new God. We are worshiping the same Allah, and you are not a new religion. You are only a small part of our religion, and you are a new branch, like a new branch of our religion. For example, in Christianity, that has different branches, or Islam has different branches, Shia, Sunni. They actually start this conversation with the Prophet, and they claim that your religion, Islam, is not a new religion. It's actually a part of our religion. You are just a branch of it. And this Allah that you are introducing it to people, it's not a new God. We are already worshiping Allah. And we also have other gods. So you only choose one of our gods. So it was actually a misleading, and they did it on purpose, or they were just confused. We don't know. Probably they did it on purpose. They knew that that Allah that they were worshiping is not the same Allah that the Prophet is talking about. But anyway, they started this conversation with the Prophet, and they said that this God is not a new God, and this religion is not a new religion. We are already believers. They assume themselves as believer. We are believer. We are worshiping Allah. But beside Allah, we have other gods. And those gods are actually a link for us to be connected to that main God. Allah is the main God. We have smaller gods. They had many gods, and we are worshiping these gods to be connected to that main God. And there is even a verse in Quran which says that لَيُقَرَّبُونَ إِلَى اللَّهِ زُلْفَى. We are worshiping these smaller gods as a link to be closer and to find a way to be closer to the main God. So anyway, they claimed this, and God sent out this chapter to answer to them, to tell them and to clear this thing first, to answer to them, and also clear it for all of us. Is it the same or not? Is it the same Allah that they are worshiping, this Allah which the Prophet is talking about, or not? So it starts with, again, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ. The first verse is talking to the Prophet directly. قُلْ is a order, is a command, and it's telling the Prophet that go to the disbelievers and talk to them. Say. قُلْ means say. So go to the disbelievers and say, يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ. O disbeliever. This is the message that God sent down. The message that God sent down. And He wants to tell disbelievers this concept. It starts from disbelievers. Oh, disbelievers. So the first thing that God told the Prophet to start the conversation with them is this title, disbelievers. And it's a label. God put these labels on them, this label on them to tell them that you are not believer. Don't assume yourself as believers, because they told the Prophet that we are believers. We are already worshiping the same God. We are already worshiping Allah. And they assumed themselves as believers. But the first important thing that God wants to emphasize on it and make it clear is this title, disbelievers. So it was telling the Prophet, go to them and talk to them and tell them that the first important thing, you are disbelievers. Also, when you see qul at the beginning of a chapter, it means there was a conversation before that. It's a sign for us. We can know that there was a conversation between people. They were discussing something, and God start answering their question and make everything clear. We have 4 chapters in Quran which start with Qul. They are famous as 4 Qul or 4 says, which means these 2 chapters which all started with Qul, they were answers from God to all of those discussions that were among society, among Muslims, or among disbelievers and Muslims and stuff like that. This one start with Qul because there was a conversation before that. People were discussing this and they were telling the Prophet that we are believers. We are already worshiping your Allah. So the first important thing that God wants to clarify was describing them as disbelievers. So say to them that you are disbelievers, and the next important thing is لا أعبد ما تعبدون. Second verse, لا أعبد ما تعبدون. I do not worship what you worship. The second important thing that you have to clarify to disbelievers is telling them that I do not worship what you worship. When we use the present tense, أعبد, worship, it means the action or the deeds that they are doing it for a long time and they do it as usual. That is their usual things, okay? And this is my usual thing. I do not worship what you worship. For a long time that I've been always worshiping Allah, it's not the same thing that you are worshiping. So I do not worship what you worship. And next verse, it says, وَلَا أَنْتُمْ عَابِدُونَ مَا أَعْبُدُ. And you are not worshippers of what I worship. Abid, which is small fa'il in Arabic, is describing a situation or a state that that person is doing it for a long time. So I translated into worshippers. They are described as worshipper, okay? They are abid, but they are not worshipper of what the Prophet worship. They are not worshippers of Allah. They are worshippers of something, but that Allah is not the same Allah that the Prophet worshipped. وَلَا أَنَا عَابِدٌ مَا عَبَدتُمْ. And I am not a worshipper of what you have worshipped. Here, abid, again, is worshipper, is ismul fa'il, is for the Prophet now. Now God is telling the Prophet, tell them that I am not a worshipper. It means the Allah that I am worshiping it, I've been worshiping it in my entire life. Because they may say that, what about before you became a prophet? What about the Allah that you were worshiping before Islam? So here is using abid to emphasize that the Allah that I am worshiping, I've been worshiping it even before Islam. And that Allah was different from your Allah. It was uniquely unique God that I am worshiping it, and it's different from what you worship. وَلَا أَنْتُمْ عَابِدُونَ مَا أَعْبُدُ. And you are not worshippers of what I worship. The fifth verse is actually repeating the third verse, and it wants to emphasize on that concept to make it clear that the Allah that you are always worshipping it is not the same Allah that I worship. So we have to pay attention to when it's using ismul fa'il, abid, like worshipper, with when it's using the verb worship. These are different. When it says worshippers, it wants to emphasize on the state that they have been in it for a long time, or the Prophet was on that state for a long time. It wants to clarify that the Allah that you've been worshiping in your entire life never was the same Allah that I was worship. And also the Allah that I've been worshiping in my entire life is not the same Allah that you worship. It wants to clarify it. It's not only a state that happened after his prophecy, like he started worshiping Allah, and this Allah is separate from their Allah after his prophecy or after his Islam. No, it wants to emphasize on this point that even before Islam, the Allah that the Prophet was worshiping was not the same Allah that they were worshiping, because the Prophet was before Islam, he was from a family. They were all followers of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and they were worshipping Allah, not that idol that they named it Allah. These are only the similar name. These are not the same. These are just the same name, not the same Allah. So these three verses, the third, fourth, and fifth verses, are actually rejecting the thoughts behind their suggestion, because they suggest the prophet that you claim that you brought a new religion and you are inviting people to worship Allah, but you have to know that this Allah is the same Allah that we were worshiping. So there was a thought behind this suggestion. These three verses are actually rejecting those thoughts. They are trying to clarify that this Allah is not the same Allah. It was never the same Allah, and it's not the same Allah. And then last verse says, "Lakum dinukum waliya din." For you is your religion, and for me is my religion. These two parties are different. These two religions are not the same. There is no commonality among them. Unfortunately, some interpretation and some translation says that it means that you can have your own religion, we can have our own religion, and we can stay together peacefully and stuff like that. Pluralism. And it's not pluralism. It's actually saying that there is no commonality among these two parties. These are two different parties, two different religions, and that Allah is only a common name. This is not the same. These are absolutely two different Allah. We become familiar with the Allah in Surah Al-Ikhlas next week to know what is actually the definition of Allah in Quran, and this is one of the most important fundamental in Islam. We will be familiar with it next week. And but this chapter is not gonna tell us about Allah. It's not gonna introduce us Allah. It's just telling those disbelievers that this misleading, you did it on purpose or you were just confused about it anyway. This is a misleading, and that Allah that you are worshiping is not the same. How was the answer from God to them? The first thing in his answer, the first step was putting this label on them, disbelievers. They have to know that they are disbelievers. They shouldn't introduce themselves as believers. The second thing, they have to know that the God or Allah, which the Prophet introduced to people and worship him, is not the same Allah that they worship, and they've never worshipped the same Allah. And at the last step, God wants to tell them that these are two distinct religions, and there is no commonality among them. These are absolutely different concepts. So now we know that what was the reason that God sent down this chapter. There are other interpretations and other stories about this, which now as we read this chapter, we can say that probably those stories are not accurate enough. Some of them says that a group of disbelievers went to the prophet and told him that for 6 months of the year, of a year, you can worship our God, and then for the rest of year, we will worship your God. In this way, we can have a kind of compromise, and we can live together peacefully and stuff like that. This kind of stories, based on what we learned through the chapters, just reading verse by verse, now we can say probably they're not accurate enough. Based on this chapter, it seems that they started a conversation with the prophet, telling him that this God is the same God that we've been worshiping in our entire life. So, and the main point and the goal of this chapter was announcing the incompatibility and differentiation between Holy Prophet religion and that of disbelievers, to clarify that these are absolutely two different religions and there is no commonality between them. So this was the first chapter that I wanted to have for today. I'm gonna stop the